friend and neighbor Connie Millar. She's a Forest Service research scientist who's done a lot of groundbreaking climate research all over California and Nevada and around the world. And Connie's going to tell us about Climate Refugia today.
Thanks, Janet. And first of all, on behalf of all of us, Janet, I want to really thank you and the work you've done with the Climate Action Group. In your group as well, I know, but I tend to think that the real grassroots activism, this is what the Mono Basin does so well, so it's absolutely wonderful. And Martha was right in saying, Kaylin and Ellery, you were just breathtaking. Absolutely fantastic science, and you also set up something for my talk, so especially Ellery, thank you for doing that. It makes my job easier. So what I wanted to do was maybe stand up a little bit higher in the air and look down on Climate Refugia and what that means in a broader perspective, how that can fit into other options that we have for adapting to a warmer world. So just in the bigger picture, what we speak of as climate adaptation practices, these are different tools and strategies that we can use to help species, ecosystems, different resources that we are concerned for adapt to and cope with the challenges of changing climates. So there is a toolbox of approaches, and that you really want to fit the right tool to the right situation. So not everything works for every situation, and if you're interested, after 10 years or so of working at this, the agencies, NGOs have developed these libraries of different strategies. And so here's just a Forest Service website here that is a library of climate adaptation tools. And I'm going to just give you a few as examples to get you in the mindset of what we mean. But the Refugia that Ellery was talking about is one of these. So some are maybe obvious and we've used them for other purposes, but we change priorities or places where we apply them in a climate context. So for instance, under climate-influenced changes in wildfire or insect outbreaks or change with the drought impacts that we've seen, then thinning forests, if you're a forest manager, is something that makes sense to improve the health of individual trees, to lower the fuels. And so it's a climate adaptation strategy. Very different context in the uplands where we have what are being called snow droughts. Either there's lower winter precipitation or the snow is melting earlier in summer. That causes these evaporative losses in the uplands where we're considered the wetlands are so important for biodiversity. So to keep water in the uplands is a goal that we have under warming climates and drying as well. And so in areas where beavers have been native, but for various reasons they were either trapped or habitat lost, they're being reintroduced as biological engineers to build dams and hold the water so that those uplands don't drain out and the water is lost. So the Grand Canyon Trust has been pioneer in using beavers, reintroducing beavers. So that's another example of a climate adaptation strategy. There's a strategy that's quite controversial, and it's intended to be applied mostly for very rare and climate endangered species. And this is called assisted migration. It's controversial from both scientific and from sort of land management aspects, but it's a drastic strategy. The idea is that for species that are, where in their present habitat, are threatened and need to move to more favorable habitats, but don't have the capacity to move for whatever reasons, either they're not able to disperse that far, or there are fragmentation or breaks in their ability to get there, that humans, managers, conservationists, actually move them to places outside of their current range, if necessary, where they could find favorable habitats. So you can imagine the reasons this might be controversial. Moving out of a native range, what are the challenges, what are the problems, what happens to the areas that are receiving these species. So as you can see, this has been suggested for, Martha mentioned American Pika, it's a species that I work with. It's been considered assisted migration, especially for the Great Basin portion of the species range. So we'll come back to that, but this is another climate adaptation strategy. But the focus of my talk is this strategy called Conserving Species for Climate Refugia, and in Climate Refugia. And Ellery has already described that and defined it, thank you. We brought forth this idea for climate adaptation, a group of folks in a paper last year. You probably recognize many of these names. Tony Lynn Morelli was a postdoc who worked with me on the INYO for working on climate adaptation. Deanna Doolin is superintendent of Devil's Postpile. Jessica Lundquist works in Yosemite. Sarah Stock is a biologist at Yosemite. So a lot of folks working together to think about this strategy. And again, just as Ellery said, there are areas that for various reasons can be buffered from the effects of changing climate, and therefore might be places that serve as safe havens. The idea came to us from paleoscientists who worked on climate changes over the last 2.5 million years, which includes the glacial, interglacial changes of the ice ages. And it was long thought in the area where the land bridge between Asia and North America was above water, because it was so cold and sea levels were low, it was called Beringia, that it was so far north, it was so cold, be under ice caps, that any species that had been there during warmer climates would be forced out far south into mid-temperate latitudes. But as climates warmed and those ice caps melted, species reappeared in this area of Beringia much faster than they could have if they had come all the way from the mid-latitudes. So that caused scientists to hypothesize and then to prove that there were areas where climate was buffered, even up in this Beringial area during the coldest parts of the Ice Age. And this is an artist's rendition of one of those areas. And of course, they probably weren't all in that square. We get a nice idea of what it might have looked like. But it's very accurate because the artist had the trees right and the understory and such. So these would have been small areas, and when the species could persist, and when climates got warmer again, they served as sources for colonization. Closer at home, pinyon pine woodlands, which you're probably familiar with, very common species in the Great Basin. Walk out the door here. Pinyon pine is a warm and dry adapted species. It's the lowest elevation conifer in the Great Basin. And we think of it almost as weedy, yet because it's everywhere, it's spreading. And what we can find is that during those cold periods of the Ice Age, I'm doing it too, see? These dates are the oldest records that we have for pinyon pine in the western Great Basin. And these old dates here are the height of the last glacial period. So there was a refugium in areas in the southern Great Basin, what is now Mojave Desert and doesn't support pinyon pine. There were no pinyon pines along the western Great Basin until climate started warming and they started migrating up. So you can see around the Mono Basin area, the species has only been here 1,000 to 2,000 years. And up in its northern boundary of its range north of Reno in the Para Mountains, it's only been there for 300 or 400 years. So it's definitely a species on the move, but my point here is that there had been refugia for these species far south. So in order to use this concept in a modern or contemporary sense, we have to know whether for the species or the condition that we're interested in, there are such environments, and whether they really could be used as a climate adaptation strategy. So I'm giving you two examples from conditions and species that I work with, American pika here, and conifers in the Great Basin. And because I started my work for several decades working in the Sierra, but increasingly I have worked in the interior of the Great Basin. So let me just say a little bit about that, because we're getting a bit more of a bird's eye view than just the Mono Basin area. I assure you, though, that the Eastern Sierra is part of the Great Basin, so it's relevant to us here. So the Great Basin is an area of over 200 square miles that includes Eastern California, Southern Oregon, a tiny bit of Southern Idaho, Western Utah, and much of Nevada. It's the area defined as where the hydrographic Great Basin, where waters flow interior to hundreds of smaller basins. There's not just one Great Basin. And waters do not flow out to the oceans, but they flow either into terminal lakes or evaporative basins that we call playas. And for there to be hundreds of basins, there have to be hundreds or many mountain ranges. That was going to be my trick question to you. Throw out a number that you might think defines how many distinct and named mountain ranges in the Great Basin there are. 200. 200. going 50, 70, 300, 653. And there are 37 that are over 10,000 feet. So it's a really very mountainous area. And for scientists like myself, it's really a very wonderful laboratory for a number of reasons. First of all, since I'm interested first in the Sierra Nevada, and now in a climate-changing world, the Great Basin mountain ranges tend to be warmer and drier, and so they give me an opportunity to see what things might be like in the Sierra under a warmer and drier environment. So it's kind of a space for time. Also, scientists like replication. So with that many mountain ranges, we can look at things in many different parts of the Great Basin and see how our hypotheses compare and how they fare. For plants and animals that live in these mountain ranges, there are a lot of challenges that are presented to them because they were able, mountain adapted species, which is my interest, they were able to get to these mountain ranges only when times were very cool, such as during those cold ice ages, and they could cross these basins. And then as conditions warmed, or cooled, and warmed, up they went into the mountains. Got that right myself. So then they get stranded in these sky islands, if you will. So many mountain species can't traverse these hot, dry basins now. So the question then becomes, and I think Martha has mentioned this already, what happens to mountain species with warming climates? Well, the big concern is that they're moving upslope. And many mountain ranges in the Great Basins are actually quite small. The Sierra Nevada, the Uinta, a couple in the Great Basin are large, but most of them are small, narrow. There's not a lot of space at the high elevations. So a concern for going off the tops, going to heaven. So case study number 1, American pika. And as I'll just say a little bit about the species. It is a small mammal that exists across western North American mountains. It's related to rabbits. It's not a rodent. And as a rabbit, it has a very poor capacity for regulating to temperature, especially warm temperatures. So unlike other species, it can't sweat, it can't pant, and so the potential for regulating its body temperature is poor. Also, pikas have very low, what we call lethal temperature, which means if they're set out in heat without any capacity to escape, at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, they die. So that's very, very cool, yeah. So that's why there has been quite a concern for them. They're very restricted in their environment, which I'll say in a minute. And there's been a lot of concern moving upslope off the top of these mountain ranges. And the concern has been especially in these Great Basin mountains, which is where most of the work has come from. And most of the work has come from 25 locations where there had been early 20th century records of pikas. And then people have gone back, and of those 25, 8 of those do not have pikas anymore. So there's been a concern for rapid, what we call extirpation, or loss of species from a particular area. So that's the big concern. They've been petitioned for listing under various Endangered Species Acts 3 times. And so there's the concern. They live in these talus environments, what we call talus. They're rocky slopes. They're not rock slides. They're where rock has come down off the under cliffs and then been reworked by freeze-thaw conditions. So they're thick rock of similar size without soil or fine sediments in them. So they're kind of, you probably all crossed them. This is Lundy Canyon on your way up to the 20 Lakes Basin. And this is the habitat for pikas. And they live in the interior of these talus fields. They don't go very far off the front, maybe 10 feet or so, to forage. Because they're non-hibernating, they collect what we call hay piles, but that's a misnomer because they'll take many different species, and they sit under the snow at their hay piles in the winter. We know this because we now have pictures of them in winter. So what we have found, and many of you have heard this, I promise you there's something a little different coming than what you've heard before, is that we've been working with the temperature regimes of these talus landforms, and we find very surprising internal microclimatic processes occur in those rocky landforms. So that in a way they're decoupled from the temperatures that are occurring outside. And that is for complex physical reasons. Because of this open matrix of the talus, the way that air sinks in, the way cold air flows inside the mantle of the talus, it sets up a convection ventilation that flows down through the talus and right over the surface of the talus. And the effect is that it serves to cool the interior of these. Think a little bit like an ice cave, but it's more of an open system. So that the interior of these taluses is very cool in the summer, is buffered from the daily extremes of heat outside, and they're warm in the winter. So it sort of serves as a very appropriate habitat for pikas. And here's just an example. This is Obsidian Dome. You probably know that right off Dead Man Summit. This is a pika habitat. And you might think it's really hot there, and it is. But here's a temperature, we put temperature probes throughout these taluses. And this is just an example of one summer in 2010. The blue are the temperatures in the interior of the talus there at Dead Man. And you can see they range from freezing, and this is through summer, 32 up to about 40 degrees, the blue there, with very little daily fluctuations. This is the talus surface, and that lethal temperature for beavers, right, pikas, is at 25. So you can see the surfaces would be very, very hot for them. So they're able to use these taluses as refugial areas on a daily basis. And we think that because these regimes are somewhat isolated from external air, that they will continue to provide this cool interior despite what's happening. They'll, of course, eventually be moving forward, but there'll be a lag in their responding to outside warming. So it's kind of like if you were living in Phoenix in the middle of summer. At noon, you wouldn't go stand out on the hot pavement. You'd go into an air-conditioned building. Well, the same with the pikas. They have this air-conditioned habitat. On hot days, they tend to forage in the cooler parts of the day. Even at night, we're documenting that now. And on cool days, they're able to forage throughout the day. The other thing about these is because these have these circulation patterns, they actually will form ice that's persistent into the summer. And it isn't that the ice came first, it's because of this cooling. It's actually cooler than the external mean temperatures. So they can set up ice in the interiors of these, and then they serve as persistent springs. So even during this long drought that we came through, the places where you would find springs are under these talus landforms. And when you have springs and wetlands, you have lush vegetation, and then you have happy pikas, because that's what they're eating. So this is the new part, and I'm very excited about this. What I spent my grueling winter in a cubicle doing is pumping numbers. And what we set out to do was to ask whether those 25 locations that have gained pika this reputation, if you will, for going off the tops of mountains and for being in a dire condition, if we could test that. And so we went about compiling all of the records that we could find, unpublished as well as published, brought them all together. These are a lot that I have done throughout the Great Basin. These are colleagues in Nevada Department of Wildlife, in the Utah Division of Wildlife, and a number of scientists who have contributed their unpublished work. We've just submitted this work. We have almost 2,400 records, and they are much broader in the Great Basin than has been anticipated or had been known. So you can see they expand. These black dots are locations for where they are occurring in the Great Basin over this much latitude and longitude, 39 different mountain ranges. They span their extant locations, so these are where their occupied sites span almost 8,000 feet elevation, and that's, you have to take into account the latitudinal, of course, lower elevations in the north and higher in the south. But still, this is a gigantic span. Certainly none of the trees I work with have this kind of breadth of elevation span. And using climate models, we were able to develop an envelope for these locations throughout the Great Basin, and in all of the climate variables, it's much greater than what had been anticipated. So again, I think because of these talus environments, they're serving as a stable area. Again, think of an air-conditioned or a warm-conditioned home, despite the outside environment. So our conclusion for now is that these tailless micro-refugia are actually helping to conserve pikas in the Great Basin under warming climates. How long they persist, we don't know, but it's at least good news for now. So my other case study is with conifers, and really I'm a forest ecologist at heart, and began my work in the Sierra Nevada with our wonderful mountain species. And as I started working more in the Great Basin, things are very different there. Some of my colleagues work in the Himalayas or the Andes. My foreign environment is Nevada and the Great Basin. It's very different in more ways than one. So the species that we're used to seeing, elevationally stratified in the Sierra Nevada with whitebark pine at the top and pinyon pine at the bottom. Things are kind of mixed up out there in the Great Basin. And not only mixed up, but species that we're used to having as extensive forests in the Sierra Nevada often occur as single trees or even as very small stands. And I wouldn't have believed it until I started working there. But here's just an example. This is the Pine Grove Hills looking east of the Wasik Range. It's in pinyon woodland, and also sometimes these montane conifers are much lower. And here in this little stand is limber pine, lodgepole pine, and Jeffrey pine occurring at a very low elevation site. Another example, this is in the northern Bodie Hills, and I'm up near Masonic Mountain looking north, and this is all pinyon juniper country that we're looking at, maybe a little bit of aspen along the stringer here. And I've been throughout much of this country for other reasons. But I'll tell you, there's one Jeffrey pine right there. And if you zoom in on this picture, you would see it. Maybe even at this scale, you could see it. Its crown is sticking up over the. So note it's in the ravines. That's important too. So then there are places where there are more typical forests, as we're used to in the Sierra. The high elevation tree line species in much of the northern Great Basin is limber pine. In the southern Great Basin, it's more bristlecone pine. So here in the Ruby Mountains, limber pine is, it looks like what you'd expect in the Sierra. Limber pine and whitebark pine are closely related. And the species spans about 9,000 to 11,000 feet in elevation range. But in hiking up to these places, then much of the Great Basin ranges aren't glaciated or not as far down. And so the lower ravines are very narrow and more V-shaped. And going up those canyons, when you're still way down in pinyon country, so 2,000 feet or so below that 9,000 feet that I said was the lower limit, you start running into subalpine conifers in these riparian zones near creeks. So here's a juvenile limber pine growing under a birch canopy in the riparian forest. And do they persist? Well, there's one sticking out above the top, surrounded by pinyon juniper woodlands around. And I started seeing these in more and more different montane species in that same situation. Another situation, this is less a sort of a no-brainer, I think, but that's what science often does, is it challenges no-brainers. Maybe it proves them or not. But when species is rare in many of these Great Basin mountains, and now I'm speaking about the higher elevation species, that they're usually on the north slopes. So here's limber pine in the Wasik Range. This is over Walker Lake near Hawthorne, which Jeff mentioned, and it's growing only on these north slopes. Bristlecone pine in the Silver Peak Range, which is east of the White Mountains. There are only about 100, well, we counted them 2 weeks ago, 147 living bristlecone pines there. And they're on the north slopes with a lot of deadwood there, so there have been larger stands on different slopes. So that was our hypothesis, that maybe these low elevation ravines and north slopes are acting as something of refugia for these Great Basin conifers when they're in these unusual contexts. We had 3 different ways that we tested that. The first was we have a database from my colleague David Charlet, who is a forest ecologist working in Nevada. He has an atlas of Nevada conifers that was out in the late 90s, and he's making a second edition. He's added hundreds of new records. So we interrogated that database for 15 upland conifers that cross 122 mountain ranges. And we asked, he had them all, each of those records, noted by what environmental context they were in. And these records were collected for various reasons, not at all to test our hypothesis. They're either collected by botanists, or various reasons that they're collected. So there's certainly a biased sample. It's not a random sample, but it's a start. And so it was an unusual conclusion. We really didn't expect there to be overall 68% of the records that were occurring in these low elevation ravine settings. Again, maybe bias, that's the way the botanists enter. It's harder to get the high elevation records, but it's a start to accept that that might be a common place for them. And similarly, we interrogated that for percents on North Slope. We actually thought this might be higher, but overall 44% of these 15 species of the records occurred on North Slopes. We also were able to measure using the temperature probes again, the eye buttons. Here's a picture of them. Ellery mentioned using them. We've had these in locations for over 10 years. We also use the PRISM climate model, which allows you to model climate over broader landscapes. And basically we found that these ravines were often cooler than the uplands in summer. Again, this cold air drainage, thanks Ellery for introducing that also. Wind is lower in those low elevation ravines under the canopy of the riparian, and pretty much the same for the North Slopes. Cooler soils moisture, lower solar radiation. And on North Slopes, again, no-brainer, snow retained longer, and conifers like that because it gives them water in these dry environments. So the third part was to evaluate whether this actually has worked as refugial environment, especially the North Slopes, in a particular area where we could test it. And then we're back to the Wasik Range then, above Hawthorne, where limber pine is growing now only on north aspect slopes. But wonderfully, there's deadwood. These are giant deadwood logs, something like you'd see in the White Mountains where you see relict wood. And they're occurring on all different slope aspects of that mountain range. And because it is so warm and dry, fires haven't been through here at this area, and so the wood is preserved on the environment. We can use tree ring methods. You're probably familiar from the White Mountains and the work there with bristlecone. How that's generally done is that we can take sections of stems, both live and dead wood, out. We can date the live trees, and then through matching the pattern of the growth rings, we can march back and date the dead wood. So we did this for about 800 stems, both live and dead, in the Wasik Range. And what this upper graph are all these 800 stems. Each one represents the age range of either a live tree, the ones that come up to the present, or dead wood. So we were able to get 4,000 years of chronology of limber pine, which is the oldest chronology for limber pine. Not as old as bristlecone, but the wood just doesn't preserve as long. So this is a nice record to be used for other things as well. We found that species grew continuously in the Wasik over 4,000 years, and that's over a lot of historic climate variability. Jeff mentioned the medieval climate anomaly. There's also been cool periods, the Little Ice Age. Late Holocene dry period was very, very dry. So trees has survived through those periods on North Slopes. Now if we look at them by slope aspect, we see that the North Slope is the most persistent, whereas on the other slopes they extirpated. Sometimes during these droughts they went into very small numbers. So it seems the North Slopes are serving as refugia through this high natural climate variability. So I would wrap this up. My conclusions then, the value of these refugia depend on the species. They might not work for some cases because there just might not be refugial environments. For picas, it appears that talus are acting as climate refugia, and especially these that have been what we call paraglacially worked. For montane conifers, North Slopes and these low ravines appear to be acting as climate refugia as well. So what? What is that's interesting to scientists? But maybe the first generalization is that this concern that we tend to falls out of our mouth, that uphill migration is the only response to warming. We need to be sure that there are not other situations, or to question that. And in the case of picas, what that might mean, since they do seem to be using these taluses as refugia, is that assisted migration, which is such a controverted adaptation strategy, might not be as necessary yet. For what does that mean? What's the so what for these conifers? I think certainly managers and conservationists haven't necessarily thought of low elevation locations as being important to conserve for montane and tree-lined species. So it just gives us a different attitude about where we might look to make protective efforts. Now, since I'm begging one more minute from Janet, I just had to share this with you. I've just come back from a trip that I'm very excited about. I'm going to put this slide in this morning because the last 2 days I've been in the Pine Grove Mountains, Pine Grove Hills, which are north and east of Bridgeport. I've been working in this mountain range, which has a lot of tailless habitat, for the last 4 years, convinced that pikas might be there, but I haven't found any trace of them at all. No sign, past and present. And there was one last area on Bald Mountain, which is the southern end of the range. This is looking southwest to the Sierra. You can see Bridgeport Reservoir here, the Bodie Hills here, Sweetwater's here. And this mountain range is it's lower than the Bodie Hills. It's almost entirely pinyon. And this talus on the south aspect slopes was chock full of pikas. So I'm now able to say 40 mountain ranges, and I'm very, very excited. So I'm glad to share that with you. So if there's more information that you'd like to have on my staff page, if you just search my name and Forest Service, I have lots of links to papers that are sometimes you have to buy if you're not connected to libraries. The Forest Service Climate Change Resource Center is a wonderful online resource. Lots of different climate adaptation, lots of model stories, a wonderful online resource to investigate. So thank you very much.